Hello, welcome to my channel. This is What If Naruto Saves Karin from a Bear in the Forest of Death Part 7. Check the author in the description and enjoy the video. And have a nice day.
I hope those guys can hold on until we get there, the first Naruto clone said as he bounded through the trees towards where the other two Chunin were supposed to be. He was being followed by the second clone, who was rather to the point in his response. I don't hear anything further ahead, so either they've managed to come out okay or we were too slow. Either way, we should hurry. Really hoping it's not the second option though. The two clones that were dispatched to investigate the status of their mission teammates were kept relatively updated with the original's progress because of all the dispelled clones that were having their memories spread around, and because they were created relatively early in the battle, they also held a bulk of the original's chakra that had yet to be returned. This afforded them a little more leeway in how they could handle the situation, whether engaging in combat, acting as a distraction, or creating shadow clones of their own to dispel and transfer the memories should the need to do so arise. However, they were not expecting to be attacked by plumes of some kind of gas bound into a serpentine form that was dense enough to be seen. The surprising sight was enough to briefly give them pause before the pair split to the left and right with chakra-powered hops. The slithering, sinuous mass of gas split into two and gave chase. I think that might be poison, the second clone said as he dodged the lunging gas that branched out into four tendrils. They didn't seem to be autonomous, so they had to be controlled by someone. Obviously, the first clone said as he molded and gathered wind chakra into his palms while avoiding his own winding set. I'm going to scatter it to thin it out. Hold your breath and charge in. However, as if triggered by their words, the gaseous poison bound into serpentine forms abruptly halted before they could touch the pair. Then they were reeled back, swallowing themselves like a vacuum was on the other end. The clones took the opportunity to chase them to the other end and see that one behind the attack was actually Okai. Apologies, Uzumaki, he said in a strained voice. He was kneeling on the ground with one chakra-coated hand hovering over a small scroll like they carried in their flak jackets, and the purplish gas was sinking into the ceiling script at the center of the array there. His other arm was being shrouded in medical chakra as Hayes worked to heal the damage that looked fairly bad, what with bones sticking out of it and all. We didn't know how many, were left. What happened? Asked the first clone. Hayes jerked his head over to where two large figures were half buried in the ground, dead to the world like fallen logs. These bozos attacked us without warning. We tried getting answers out of them, but the sheer stupid made questioning a pain, and when we tried to regroup they cut us off and slugged Okai with a mean punch. One solid hit did this to his arm, so we decided to take them out the same way we do the larger honey badgers, covering their faces with poison while restricting their movements. They could only hold their breath for so long. His squinted eyes turned to the pair. What happened on your end? Were you attacked? The clones gave them a brief report as more information filed in until they abruptly started glowing as the final spare clone dispelled itself. The first Naruto clone looked down at the film of chakra covering him. We should disperse if these two are okay. That should send the excess chakra and memories back to the original. The second clone stopped him. The sudden rush might throw him off if he's still in the middle of fighting Mizuki though. Just create a clone and then disperse it. The memories should go to all of us, and the flux won't be great enough to throw off the balance of yang to normal chakra, I think. Sounds good enough. The first clone popped a single clone into existence and dispersed it just as quickly. In hindsight, we really should have tested how this works with pre-existing shadow clones, huh? The second shrugged. Maybe we should have found a way to store it all at once without the need for doing it like this. He tapped his chin in thought. Actually, can you store shadow clones as they are in a scroll? I know that some techniques can be. You know that's kind of weird talking to yourselves like that, right? Hayes pointed out as he continued working on the other Chunin's arm. If the original you is still fighting, then go where you're needed. We'll be along in a bit. The taste of copper permeated Mizuki's mouth as he spat to the side, leaving a mix of blood and saliva on the ground. Then he took a deep breath to numb the pain and gather his thoughts to figure out what just happened. 1 minute he was advancing, the next he was aching and hearing the brat making demands. The fact that yes, he lost in a contest of power and speed to some kid that didn't even manage to graduate under normal circumstances took a moment to register. That shouldn't be possible. He could still feel the wellspring of power within him from the potion he took. The amount of chakra leaking out of his body was so potent that his muscles and senses were heightened as a mere side effect. It didn't make sense for Naruto to be strong enough to keep up with him without using the nine-tailed fox's power. He has to be lying. Blinking away the spots in his eyes, he noted his head hurt as he looked at the boy in the distance that stood in a relaxed stance. His cerulean eyes had a mild golden tint to them that somehow gave the impression that he felt no fear or need for concern. That was insulting in every sense of the word, giving birth to anger within him that drove strength into his body. Wiping the remaining blood away from his mouth, Mizuki staggered onto his feet and covered up the nervousness he felt with bravado. "Not bad, brat. I actually felt that." "Then it's a good thing I didn't go all out," he said back, a cruel calmness to his voice as the chakra coming from him flared for a moment and thickened somewhat. "You're frailer than you look in that state, and I don't want to kill you since you're the last one alive that can answer my questions. We'll see who's frail when I get my hands on you." Mizuki poured chakra into his legs for an explosion of movement, only for him to feel pain again on the side of his head like someone took a hammer to it. The world blinked for a moment as he twirled on his grounded leg and then regained his balance and sense of awareness. Right in time for his feet to be swept from underneath him as Naruto went from a low leg sweep to a rising kick into his abdomen that stole Mizuki's breath. "This can't be happening," he thought as he fell to his knees in pain while struggling for breath. Looking up, he met with the disinterested eyes of the boy again that was mocking him and the strength he had attained through the knowledge of Lord Orochimaru, who recognized his drive and potential. It infuriated Mizuki even further. He swung his fist in an attempt to knock the perceived smug-off boy's face with all his might. Naruto wordlessly deflected it with his forearm. Then he thrust his opposing knee out in a flash towards Mizuki's broad and exposed chest. It hit hard enough to knock him backwards with a pained sound escaping his lips. "This can't be happening," he thought again as he reconsidered his options in a hurry. He could try Genjutsu and then attacking him from behind. But first he needed to get away, so he sank earth chakra into the ground and began to slip below the surface. Not this time. Only for a comparatively small hand to grab him by the hair and fling him through the air into another tree that broke under his weight and momentum and crashed down on him. He managed to push the heavy trunk off of him just in time to hear the tagged kunai burying itself into the bark. It detonated a half-second later as he tried to get away from the explosion with a hurried body flicker. Fire and force engulfed him for a moment. Trails of smoke wafted from Mizuki's body as he was thrown off his feet by the tail end of the explosion, hitting the ground some distance away from the blasting site. He looked up as charred splinters rained down to see Naruto walking towards him in a deceptively slow pace. "Ready to talk yet?" he asked plainly, throwing 4 yellow-rimmed tagged kunai around Mizuki. A 5th appeared in his hand, and when it received chakra the other 4 formed a film around the man to act as a makeshift prison. "At this point, it's clear you simply can't win. Tell me where Kabuto is, and I'll settle for leaving you locked away rather than dragging this out further." Mizuki gritted his teeth at the thought that the brat wasn't even taking him seriously. He pounded at the film of chakra to no avail. Trapped and toyed with by the former failure of his class, Mizuki's anger peaked at that point and he tugged on the power within. In response, his muscles swelled further. Orange fur began to cover his flesh, lined with black stripes. His fingernails sharpened to claws, his teeth stretched into fangs, and his face became bestial as more tiger features set in. Thrumming with power, Mizuki roared, chakra lacing his very voice to the extent that the resulting sound wave tore the tags of the kunai apart and freed him. "Now who can't win?" he said with a sneer as he towered over the comparatively tiny shinobi, on his knees and holding his ears. "I'm going to rip you to shreds." "Owawa," Naruto thought as he uncovered his ears and rose to his feet. The force of the roar had made his ears ring to the point that his brain itself trembled, taking away one of his sharpened senses. He made a mental note to work on that as Mizuki, whose frame had grown even larger and feral, lunged for him like a, well, tiger, obviously. He was slow, even slower than before. Naruto managed to get around the blow easily as Mizuki brought his clawed hand onto the ground. The packed earth shattered fairly deeply to create a crater as a result. He swapped speed for strength then. Naruto mused as he reached into his shuriken pouch and flung a handful of them at the very large target. Mizuki didn't bother trying to block them as he went after the younger shinobi again. Just as well, they didn't even pierce his skin or graze the flesh that was taut against corded muscles. Okay, I'll just treat it like the battle with Gaara when he was partially transformed. Dashing forward and sliding under the incoming arm, Naruto reached into his pouch. He pulled out a pair of concussive tags to use as knuckle dusters and rammed his fists Mizuki's torso before firing them off. The recoil of released kinetic force from the tags made his arms buckle as the slips of paper tore themselves to shreds, but the yang chakra reinforced his body from any further damage as the directed shockwave did its work. Mizuki, who was already aerial from his lunge, was thrown back forcibly. Blood left his mouth as the force shot through the corded muscle beneath his skin to hammer organs and rattle bones. Yet he managed to dig into the ground with his claws and upturned a trench as he slid to a stop. Naruto brought his hands around to his pouch for another pair, while doing a mental count of how many he had left for that approach. He had 4 tags of that nature remaining, with the rest being the explosive variety. As long as he avoided hitting the heart or head, he should manage to avoid killing him at least. That was the plan before Mizuki rose to his feet, looking no worse than before as the point of impact steamed. "You can heal quickly too?" The dark chuckle that the Tiger Man made pretty much answered that question while he patted the area down. Then he roared again, loud enough to be heard around the woodlands. The fierce scream blanked out Naruto's vision as it assailed his senses until he covered his ears. In that space of time, Mizuki crossed the distance and was getting ready to drive his claws into the younger shinobi's skull. The pull of a substitution saved him as one of the clones took his place, a spiraling sphere of chakra in its hand. It twisted its body underneath the surprise assault and delivered the rising Rasengan into Mizuki's torso, right where the concussive tags had gone off. The spiraling mass of chakra dug into the strengthened flesh, grinding against it fiercely, while the clone pushed as hard as it could to send Mizuki spiraling into the air, screaming. The first clone dispersed itself. Memories flooded the original of its return and the plan it formulated with the second clone, which broke from cover to run over to just under the point of launch. He ran towards it and then leapt into its cupped hands. The moment his foot touched down it threw him as hard as it could, strength bolstered by the yang chakra that had permeated it. Then the second clone dispersed as well. Naruto ended up rising next to Mizuki with both his arms chambered and fingers laced. The excess yang chakra from the 2 clones swelled the aura he wore around himself to the point of being a few inches thick. He gathered and condensed it all onto his fists and slammed down into Mizuki's unprotected back. The golden hammer blow flared as contact sent the Tiger Man rocketing right back down to earth. The impact shook and upturned the ground, throwing up a cloud of dirt. It slowly rained back down as Naruto eventually landed at the rim of the crater that formed with Mizuki at the center. Please don't get up again, Naruto thought. His muscles began to ache as the last of the yang chakra burned out from the assault, but it was tolerable. He would be beyond sore in the morning though. Mizuki started moving, pushing himself off the ground. His body began to steam, accelerated healing at work, and then his bulging muscles began to shrivel and wilt. His skin darkened and wrinkled as though he was being desiccated to the point of mummification before he barely managed to flip onto his back. "Aha!" His voice came out as a dry rasp. What's happening?" Naruto had no clue whatsoever, but it looked bad. Fortunately, the other two that were slower than his young, empowered clones arrived. He turned to the only healer of the group and asked, "Can you see about him? He's the only one left, and he knows something." Heias complied, leaning down over the wheezing and frail-looking man Mizuki had become. Medical chakra shrouded his hands. He held them over Mizuki's chest and began his work. Okai walked up next to Naruto and adjusted his glasses with his good hand. "What did you do to him?" "I just hit him hard," Naruto said. He had transformed himself into this Tiger Man form, and it made him hard to hurt, plus he kept healing himself. I just needed him to stay down. "The damage done to this guy is mostly internal," Heias said. "His chakra network has basically torn itself to shreds from the inside out, and his body is deteriorating on a cellular level. You don't get that kind of damage from brute force. It's more than likely they were forced over their limit and were constantly straining to keep themselves together until they just couldn't anymore, probably from the transformation and healing you mentioned." A dry wheeze left Mizuki's mouth as he tried to raise himself up, but couldn't. "Don't bother," Heias told him bluntly. He didn't have a reason to show sympathy given what transpired. The more physical activity you try, the faster your body breaks down. As it is, you've only got minutes to live at best, and that's only because I'm barely slowing it down. We're too far away from anyone skilled enough to save you." Hearing that, Naruto approached Mizuki before he could pass away to get answers. "Tell me where Kabuto wanted you to take me and what he's planning." "And never," he muttered weakly. Naruto scowled. Even on his deathbed he was being spiteful. But before he could say anything else to try and get Mizuki to talk, Okai placed a hand on his shoulder and led Naruto a few steps away from the dying man to talk. "Tell me, what sort of man is this person?" he asked quietly. "What do you mean?" "Your clones gave us a brief report on him and why he came, but they didn't go into what sort of man he is. From just now I could gather that he is quite a spiteful individual, but that can be used to our advantage providing we know the angle to approach." "He wants power?" Naruto offered after some thought. "Like a lot of it. To the point he betrayed the village and then came after me just because someone else promised it to him. Does that help?" "The ambitious type, I can work with that. Stay here." Naruto watched as the older Chunin walked over to where Mizuki was and crouched down to whisper to him. Whatever was being said was below what he could hear, leaving Naruto to simply stand there and focus on molding more chakra from his spiritual and physical energy while he waited. His awareness snapped back to the other pair of Chunin when the light of the healing died minutes later. Mizuki wasn't moving and his eyes were closed. He was gone. Heias unraveled one of the scrolls meant for storing human corpses and proceeded to enclose the dead body inside of it. Okai watched for a moment longer and then approached Naruto. "Do you have a way of contacting the village as soon as possible?" "I can summon a messenger toad." They had a direct line to the village from what he knew. Naruto began the hand seals and partitioning off the appropriate amount of chakra for the summoning when he received a nod telling him to go ahead. "What did he tell you?" A prison break was executed by agents of the Hidden Sound, with himself being the sole one pulled aside for capturing you. It was done in the middle of the night over a day ago, which is plenty of time for them to scatter out. I'm not certain if the village is aware, but the information needs to reach the Hokage as soon as possible. Naruto slammed his hand onto the ground. Sealing script etched itself onto the grass. A red toad with blue marking around its eyes and a pair of goggles appeared in a puff of smoke. "Kosuke reporting for duty," the toad said. "You got a message you want delivered?" "I need you to deliver this, along with a storage scroll, to the Hokage as soon as possible," Okai said as he set down a scroll and started jotting down the information on it. It is of the absolute importance that it reaches his eyes only as we suspect there is an infiltrator. What will we do next? Naruto asked. The mission had clearly gone awry. We're heading back to the village as quickly and carefully as possible, Heian said, coming over with the scroll carrying Mizuki's corpse. With the prisoners of war and other inmates freed, the number of hostile shinobi wandering around the land of fire could number hundreds. And since none of us are trackers or sensors, the best thing we can do is get you back inside the village walls where this won't happen again. I guess that Naruto froze at that moment as realization set in. Kabuto had sent Mizuki after him. Leaving aside that meant someone had to leak where he was going for his mission. Having so many prisoners getting out meant they'd have to send out everyone capable of tracking and sensing available, and that likely included Karin. That bastard. Naruto pulled out the sealing slip that contained Byaku's mask and popped it out. Using the same gash he made for the summoning to unlock the mask, he summoned forth the white tiger. Byaku came to a stop behind him as he looked over to Okai after the toad disappeared in a puff of smoke to take the shortcut back to the village. Where'd Kabuto want him to take me? Okai shook his head in response to the question as he rose to his full height. Telling you would be the same as doing the job for him. You don't understand. I think they're going after another censor by doing all of this to lure them out and grab them. If the village already knows about the escapees, then they've probably sent her ahead. Then we'll have to send another message, he said. If she's already in the field and your reasoning is valid, they'll assemble a retrieval team and bring her back to the village. That didn't help rid Naruto of the underlying anger and unease that he felt. Karin was terrified of going back, and for good reason. Just the thought of the things Kabuto did during the invasion was enough to get his blood boiling. But when he thought of her going through that after finally getting a chance to start over, he could barely keep himself from shaking with rage. Byaku craned its head towards him at sensing the rising anger through their spiritual link. Are they enemies? Naruto shook his head as he mounted the tiger, soundlessly responding back through the link. Karin's in trouble. I don't know how to find her. The white tiger turned to the east. She is that way, but far. Naruto perked up at that. How do you know that? The spiritual link from her last use is faint and non-active, but the connection is how we identify those of Uzumaki blood and remember them. Through that I can find her. That's good news. Naruto gave the other two a side glance while they were discussing something in a hushed tone. He doubted that they'd be on board with the plan forming in his head, and Byaku would be weighed down by them anyway. He turned his attention back to Byaku and asked, "Can you reach her before burning through your reserves?" "Most likely at full speed. It depends on terrain between us." That made sense. It boasted its capability with speed when Karin had summoned it the first time, so running was what it was good at. Though, given how things became a blur after a certain point, he'd have to leave the steering to Byaku and anchor himself down. Naruto realized he would probably get in trouble for this, abandoning these two to save her. But Karin was being hunted and didn't even realize it. The thought of losing the first family he had, the first girl who told him that she cared for him that way, he couldn't do it. Just don't abandon me, or I won't have anything left. That was all she asked of him when he saw her after everything that happened. It was a simple wish that he promised he would live up to. Nothing would be worth it if he couldn't keep that promise and save her when the chance to do so was there. His resolve solidified. Even if he got into trouble, he could live with the consequences of that. As long as she remained alive and out of that bastard's hands. Anchoring himself with chakra, he gave the order. Run as fast as you can to her. Byaku crouched low and its muscles tensed. The other two took notice of the sudden change. But before they could even get words out, it was too late. The white tiger exploded into motion, upturning the ground beneath its feet as it became a white blur. I wish I kept my goggles, Naruto thought, as the rushing air whipped at him violently, threatening to tear him from his mount if he hadn't anchored himself. They were moving faster than he'd ever done so before, to the point that the blinding wind even threatened to crush his eyes if he didn't squint them. but he didn't have Byako slow down in the slightest. Instead, he lowered his riding posture until he was hugging Byako as tightly as he could while they sped off into the night. "Which way?" asked the male Anbu officer, adorned in a tiger mask, racing ahead of Karin. "To the left and further ahead," Karin said, her breath ragged as she struggled to keep pace with her handler and the two Anbu officers accompanying them over the flat lands at a frantic rate. She was exhausted at this point, having been running around all day. Tiger sped forward while making seals and then slammed his hand into the ground. Earth chakra sank below and then warped the soil beneath the chakra signature that they had been chasing. That newly formed stone then began to ascend an explosive rate, forcing the signature upwards until he broke through the surface. The prisoner, a man with black hair and a rugged scar, then proceeded to turn in the air towards the chasing party. Karin sensed he was sending chakra into the stones that he had in the palm of his hand and destabilizing them. "I'm not going back to prison." "Look out!" Karin shouted as he tossed them. They broke off to the left and right before the stones exploded from the inside out. Falling at an angle, the stone shards had enough momentum to punch through the hard-packed dirt as they rained down. The prisoner then landed while making hand seals to mold his earth chakra before he slammed it into the ground. The abundant amount of chakra spread over a wider area in a mere moment. The soil was collected, hardened, and transmuted into shaped stone just beneath their feet.
"It's an area-wide attack," Karin shouted before a series of blossoming stone spikes rose into the air like columns in an attempt to skewer them all from below.
He looked towards Karin, eyes narrowed in realization. She felt him gather chakra into his hands before thrusting it into the nearest structure. The act caused the chakra holding the stone spikes to collapse into soil once more, creating a vast dirt cloud that obscured their vision and hindered their ability to breathe. Choked for breath, Karin felt his chakra signature rush towards her while coated in a secondary layer. She couldn't scream or shout a warning without suffocating either while in the dirty veil. So she tried to run away with her eyes closed towards Anko's chakra signature. Her handler took notice apparently, since a pair of serpent-outlined chakra signatures coiled around Karin before pulling her out of the lingering cloud of dirt at a surprising speed. She took a deep breath and opened her eyes to see the growing silhouette, which Anko flung a trio of kunai at. They bounced off as he cleared the earthen veil, revealing he was clad in stone-like armor, while sliding along the ground that became mud at his feet, intending to kill Karin to ensure his escape. Tiger promptly proceeded to erect a wall of earth in front of the beeline charge, tripping him up as Anko grabbed Karin and darted to the side. His stumble was brief, and the prisoner quickly got back onto his feet. But that was a moment too late as the female Anbu bear rushed in with a pair of chakra blades that crackled with lightning. She rammed them into his chest, and Karin felt his chakra signature die out even before Tiger followed up by taking off the escaped prisoner's head with his sword. Karin sighed as it was finally over, falling to her knees in exhaustion and relief that she was still alive. Not only had she done more than her fair share of running, but that hadn't been the first one who tried to take her out when they realized she was the one responsible for tracking them down. She really wasn't suited for the front lines. "Good work," Anko said as she passed a ration bar to Karin, while the other two proceeded to deal with the corpse. "That makes 5 today." "That was terrifying," Karin said as she unwrapped it, musing on the events of the day. That was a minuscule amount given the sheer number of escaped prisoners of war, but they had enough squads and other shinobi available that each of them catching that amount was enough to significantly dent the majority that was still around. The rest had likely fled the land of fire by now and were a less immediate concern. Even the last one didn't get that close to me or get this far away. He wouldn't be a former Jounin if he couldn't do that much. Anko shook her head in disappointment as they finished sealing the corpse up, head and all. "I recognized him from some time ago, but he used to be one of ours until he got caught trading secrets to Stone. The war was over and his service record was good enough that they opted not to execute him." And apparently the prison was considered bad enough that he opted to try and fight his way out than go back, Karin thought silently. Her mind's eye was still active to observe for anyone getting the drop on them, which was why she picked up the serpent-shaped mass of chakra slithering their way. She presumed that it was one of Anko's summonings, given that she had sent the corpses sealed in scrolls off to the village with them, and each one had a unique signature that she hadn't felt before. One of your snakes is on the way back. Her handler's reaction to that was to give her a mildly confused look, before narrowing her eyes and signaling the two Anbu officers. Which direction? Karin raised a brow in alarm. From the village's direction. Is there something wrong? My summonings have orders to disperse after reaching the village gates and passing the scrolls along to the shinobi waiting there. They don't return that way. The meaning behind that clicked in her mind right before the chakra within the serpent flared and suddenly became one that she recognized with the arrival of even more signatures from a summoning technique. Then pain blossomed up her leg like thorns sprouting from inside her as the seal of subjugation activated. Karin fell down screaming, exhaustion and hunger forgotten in the wake of unyielding agony and fear. The sight of the body encompassing markings spreading across her red-haired charge made it abundantly clear to Anko what was happening. She had been briefed on both how Karin got that curse mark and how it was triggered the last time. So she knew the proper thing to do was to lower the girl to the ground gently to avoid causing her any unnecessary pain. The snake channeled Kabuto's chakra just now and summoned 4 different chakra signatures, Karin explained while rigidly lying still to avoid setting it off. They're coming after me. He must have done something to mask it until it was close enough, since he knows how it works. Then focus on reinforcing the seal the Hokage gave you to stop it so that we can move, Anko said before she proceeded to perform a summoning of her own to call forth a snake eater. It was a rather large serpent by normal standards, resistant to poison, capable of tracking, killing, and devouring smaller snakes easily. She gave it the command to hunt down the snake responsible, triggering the seal of subjugation. I'm trying, but I can't until the snake making it flare up is dealt with, and they'll get here before yours reaches it. One of them is coming from underground even now, and another is spitting a mass of chakra out of their mouth and shaping it into, I think, a bow and arrow that they're getting ready to fire. Tiger took the warning as a cue to raise a stone wall roughly twice their height to act as a bulwark, believing that it would be enough to stop the projectile. That was proven false when said arrow drilled through the wall with enough force that a significant amount of it shattered on impact. And then it kept going and bore a hole through Tiger's torso that Anko could see through before he fell down dead. She bit back a swear word before Karin shouted a warning in time for her to jump back from the emerging pair of hands from the ground. The bare-masked Anbu shoved the lightning-filled chakra blades into the ground and then discharged them as an electrified web, dealing both damage and inhibiting the earth chakra that allowed the assailant to move freely. At the same time, needing fire chakra into her lungs, Anko spat out a wall of flames to buy them precious seconds to grab Karin and run before 2 more figures broke through the fire to give chase. The pained screaming in her ears from the girl she was carrying over her shoulder, due to the black tendrils of electricity ravaging her, did not help as they ran. But if they stayed and fought, then they ran the risk of her being taken. That was unacceptable since the Hokage entrusted the girl to her care. Try and wrap your chain around yourself, see if that can help. She was hoping that if it nullified foreign chakra, it would likely do the same to the invasive chakra that stemmed through the markings covering her body. Of course, that became a moot point when a melodious sound reached their ears from a flute. In the wake of the invasion, they immediately took that as a sign of a genjutsu being cast and reacted appropriately since a moment's hesitation could mean death. Both Anko and Bear used their chakra to block their ears, stopping yin chakra from entering them through sound waves. However, it was at the expense of one of their major senses. That would make escaping much harder unless they dealt with the flute player. Exchanging a glance with the Anbu officer, Anko made a series of hand signals and received a nod in response. Then she whirled around and jumped back while extending both hands towards the pink-haired flutist and the young man who had half his face covered by his hair. Snakes burst from her sleeves towards them a second later. Stretching and slithering through the air, over a dozen serpents speared out from within the sleeves. Their pursuers split apart to avoid being bitten by the venomous fangs, and Bear rushed in while drawing her sword. She attacked the flutist with her blade, while Anko kept the other one at a distance with the striking snakes, and in the exchange she managed to destroy the flute with a well-placed slash so they could use their ears again. However, the ground beneath them began to flip over like a massive table before they could press the advantage and kill the disarmed flutist. The wall that had been raised was then shattered from the opposite side as a stout figure broke through it, creating a rain of boulders that forced Anko to break away and run with Karin, who was no longer screaming in pain. Had she fallen unconscious? "Kayuya, get them!" Anko heard the pale blue-haired young man order as he tried to avoid the tendrils of lightning that the bear-masked Anbu unleashed as she held back both him and the stout newcomer. "You're useless here." The newly identified Tayuya let loose an indecent string of words as she threw down the halves of her flute and then chased after Anko. Even carrying her charge, Anko was faster than the pink-haired young woman at full speed. As things stood, with the flare of lightning from another technique showing that the fight behind them was still ongoing, she could escape. She then addressed Karin, who was hanging over shoulder, to check if she was conscious or not. "Hey, you doing okay back there?" Ye, despite saying that, there was a notable discomfort in her voice. "I have the chains wrapping around my ankle small enough to avoid messing with your chakra, and it's suppressing it from hurting me, but I can't keep it up forever. The snake I sent out to kill it will get the job done soon enough, and that should cause it to retract. Can you tell me how the fighting is going on the other end?" The woman from Anbu is fending them off for now, but I'm not sure how long she can last. The one who shot the other is outside of my range, while the chakras of the two that she's fighting are a bit off. I think one of them actually managed to absorb and attune some of her chakra to his when he hit her just now, and the other guy feels like he has two bodies in one. I think it's a bloodline. Make sure you take in everything you can. The information will be crucial when we get back to the village." "Yes, ma'am." Her voice abruptly cut off and tension threaded her body before she spoke again. "The woman chasing after us is activating a curse mark." "What?" Anko looked over her shoulder to see that Tayuya's figure was slowly being encroached by black lines. They expanded over her frame, dyeing her skin an earthen hue while her hair grew longer and wilder. Combined with the horns jutting out of her head and her eyes becoming a mix of yellow and black, it gave her an inhuman aura. "Now you're mine," she roared as the altered form increased her speed explosively. Crossing the distance between them despite their already breakneck pace, she lunged to tackle the pair. Before impact, Anko tossed Karin into the air, while trusting that she would be able to land safely, and then summoned more serpents from her sleeves to entangle and restrain Tayuya. These in particular were a myriad of different skin tones, each having a different kind of poison to ensure they killed their prey. They lashed out with their venomous fangs and elongated bodies, only for their fangs to break against her skin and their bodies to be ripped apart by the sheer strength she had. Reaching out and grabbing Anko by the forearm with inhumanly strong fingers, Tayuya put strength into them. That alone managed to break the bones with an audible crunch. Then she mercilessly used it to swing Anko overhead and then slammed her into the ground hard enough to knock loose a pained cry. Gritting her teeth from the pain, Anko used her other arm to bring a kunai around and flung it towards the transformed woman's dark eyes. Even if the flesh was tempered, she suspected that the eyes were still vulnerable to sharp, pointed steel. Unfortunately, Tayuya avoided it by moving her head to the side. "Nice try, worm." She squeezed the broken forearm as she lifted her back into the air, sending sharp jolts of pain surging through Anko that was only topped when Tayuya delivered a punch to her stomach that knocked the breath out of her. Dropping her to the ground, leaving Anko curled and clutching her stomach, the transformed flutist then chambered her leg to kick her while she was down. Straining for breath, Anko could only look up as the foot came around. The only reason the swing went wide as it neared her head was because her assailant was abruptly jerked back. A chakra chain was coiled around Tayuya's throat, courtesy of Karin standing on the other end. She was free of the markings, but looked nervous all the same with the chain coming from an outstretched hand. "You think this weak chain can hold me?" she said in a tone that promised pain as she clutched at the chain around her throat and pulled. The chain barely budged, leaving her to go wide-eyed as her hand and upper torso began reverting back to normal. "What the—" Anko tackled the younger woman with her good arm, shoving her elbow against the back of Tayuya's head to leave her face down in the dirt. She then looked up to Karin and tried to tell her to wrap her entire body in chains. The words wouldn't come out because of the punch to her stomach, leaving Anko barely able to breathe, let alone speak. But the message carried as Karin unleashed a second chain that speared through the air and coiled around the legs, next as the one around her neck slithered and spiraled downwards. Not even 5 seconds later, Tayuya was completely bound on the ground. Then Karin came over, snapped the ends together to connect them, and saw Anko's arm. "I don't like people doing this, but I just felt the Anbu woman's chakra signature die out, and making that many dense chains has left me almost out of chakra." She crouched down and presented a spot of unblemished flesh on her left arm. "You need to bite me so we can keep running." Anko bit down and strength filled her. Broken bones snapped into place, bruised muscles healed, and torn flesh mended good as new. She got to her feet, ignoring the shuddering moan of guilty pleasure that left the younger girl looking embarrassed when it was over, and then went over to the bound prisoner spewing profanities. "Just wait until I get free, you!" Her threats were silenced as Anko kicked her in the jaw hard enough to knock her out. Then a trio of serpents with paralyzing venom emerged from her sleeve and bit Tayuya to make damn sure she couldn't move when she woke up. "They're not going to stop chasing us just because we have a hostage," Karin said, looking off in the distance. "We need to go. We also need to know how they found us in the first place and where they came from. Otherwise it'll happen again later on." Anko finished performing hand seals for a summoning. The moment she slammed her hands onto the ground, a snake that was roughly half Karin's size in height appeared. "Take the prisoner to the village." She watched as the snake bobbed its head in understanding before it curved around, opened wide, and swallowed the foul-mouthed woman whole before sinking under the ground as though it was water. The stomach of the mole snake could fit a single person inside to transport them underground, only breaching to refill the makeshift holding cell with air. But it was uncomfortable for the person inside on all accounts, as anyone who'd been swallowed whole could attest to. Even if she woke up from that kick in a few minutes, the poison would leave her unable to move, and the chains would leave her unable to use any technique until it spat her out at the village gate. Satisfied, Anko then grabbed Karin again and started running as quickly as she could. They were still a long way from safety. Thakin pressed on as fast as he could to make up for lost time. The Anbu that held them at bay had been a right pain in the ass, and he could still feel where that blade of hers managed to bite into his skin and numb his body. If not for the cursed mark, it might have been fatal. Running alongside of him, Jirobo asked, "What happened to Tayuya?" "Don't know." He had sent her ahead because she was slowing them down, but with her cursed mark she should have been able to keep pace with the fleeing women and at least stall them. But aside from the battle damage that marred the landscape, there was no trace of her. "I think they managed to take her out." "What do we do?" Jirobo asked. "Stick with the plan," he said. "Lead them to Kitamaru's trap, corner them, and break every bone in their bodies to keep them from running again." But if they managed to slip away, the rotund teen trailed off. There was no need for him to finish. Kabuto had openly questioned their usefulness after their failure to stop the Hawkage and Toad Geezer from killing Orochimaru with their own barrier. Losing track of the one that could be used in lieu of them to bring him back would just give Kabuto a reason to kill them all or wake Kimimaro to do the job. Sakin gritted his teeth beneath his painted lips at the thought. Keep them in sight and attack from a distance, he ordered. Make sure that they go the way we need them to, but stay far enough away so that whatever happened to Tayuya doesn't happen again. Jirobo nodded his head as black triangles from his cursed mark began crawling across his skin like ivy, matching the encroaching lines that covered Sakin's as their speed hastened. They've caught up with us, Karin said from her position on Anko's back. The older kunoichi was much faster than Karin, and that made a world of difference if they were going to escape, so neither contested it. And they've activated their cursed marks. I see them, Anko said. She supposed it was just hopeful wishing they'd lose the pair if she ran as hard as she could, but the cursed mark seemed to be the bane of her existence in every sense of the word as the stout one slammed his hand onto the ground, making jagged stone teeth erupt from the ground. She darted around them and redoubled her pace to keep the distance between them from shrinking. They wouldn't last at this rate. They had to get out from the open and off the ground before one of those earth techniques got lucky and hit them. That was why, when the trees came into view, Anko considered it a blessing that marked the halfway point between them and safety. Do you sense any chakra within the forest ahead? No, Karin replied. I don't sense anything there. Good, now hold your breath and close your eyes. She reached into her pocket with one hand and tossed a small sphere bundled in paper over her shoulder, a string connected to it. A yellowish fume billowed out when she pulled it, creating a veil of smoke mixed with irritants that would sting the lungs and eyes to obscure them from sight and by time. From there she bound upwards, ascending the trunks to gain higher ground among the trees. The thick branches offered enough support that she could navigate them with ease. Are they still following us? I think you caught them in it. They've stopped chasing us, at least for now. Good. Anko wiped her face with her sleeve to clear it of sweat as she contemplated their next move. She could keep going, hoping that they could use that time to get enough distance. And then what? Getting to the village would be best, but even at full speed they matched her with their cursed marks. Stamina could only be replaced with chakra for so long before she no longer had the physical energy to convert it. Then her ears picked up the familiar sound of metal cutting through the air. In a single, practiced motion, she lashed out with a shuriken towards it, and the clash of metal signaled that it intercepted a kunai that had been sent towards them. I thought you said you didn't sense any chakra. I didn't, Karin claimed as more flew in from different angles, only to be intercepted with shuriken. I still don't. Hop down then, Anko said as she came to a stop on the dense limb of one particularly hardy tree and crouched down to let Karin dismount her. That freed her up to handle any more surprise attacks, and she held shuriken between her fingers, ready to be thrown at the next flurry of projectiles. But nothing came as they stood there, leaving them both unnerved. Anko sharpened her eyes and ears with chakra, looking for any sign of their assailant. It was only then that she noticed the gossamer thin strands of spider's silk threading through the whole forest and a lack of animal noise. Look out, Karin abruptly said as she threw herself forward, pushing both herself and Anko from where they'd been. A loud thunk could be heard as a golden arrow embedded itself deeply into the trunk, following a path where her legs would have been shot through from the momentum. Karin then looked in the direction it came from. That was the sniper from before. I felt his chakra just now, but it's gone. He must be suppressing it as he moves around. Anko's grip on the shuriken tightened as she realized too late that they'd fallen into a trap. Damn, all this time they've been hurting us. What do we do then? Karin asked. The other two are moving now. They'll catch us if we sit still. She gazed off into the darkness for a moment before sighing exasperatedly and rubbing the back of her neck. We're already inside, so I guess we have to break through it. The traps can be managed, but if we stand around, we'll be sniped or caught by the other two. Follow me and tell me the moment you feel any chakra. Karin struggled to keep up with Anko as the older kunoichi went ahead of her in great bound, intentionally making herself a target for the traps that could get in their way. Streaks and flashes of metal flittered in the darkness towards her, only to be deflected. That left Karin free to act as a censor, which allowed her to get a feel for just how dire the situation was. Anko's chakra reserves were largely stable, and she was expending the minimal amount to keep going. But it didn't change the fact that she had little over a third of what they started with when they began to flee from their pursuers. And when Karin factored in how they'd been running around all day to round up the escaped prisoners, there had to be a limit to how many more times she could mold chakra to replace what had been lost. In contrast, the two that were chasing them were at the top of their game. Their cursed marks weren't active anymore, but they didn't need them to be. They'd already lured them into the spider's parlor, and now they only had to wait until Karin and Anko had been cornered. They'd struggled to deal with just one of them, and that was only because Karin had managed to catch the flutist off guard with her chakra chains. It wasn't likely to happen again, and she only had so much chakra left given that she was tired as well. And then there was the sniper, who snapped to her attention the moment his chakra system flared to life and his cursed mark followed. He formed the construct bow from his mouth, followed by an arrow that he took aim with. She could make out that he was going for Anko just before he loosed the shot. "Jump up," Karin said in warning. Anko did so, and the arrow whizzed by, aimed to tear her legs from under her again. It wasn't meant to be a killing shot, which didn't make sense to Karin. If they were trying to capture her, killing the person keeping her alive would be the most efficient way of doing it. So why weren't they aiming to kill? There has to be more to it, Karin reasoned in a moment of thought. Even before she wrapped the chains around the other one, the flutist had the chance to kill Anko by simply caving in her chest with her strengthened fist, rather than knock the wind out of her and try to kick her around. Given how quickly they'd worked to kill the Anbu officers accompanying them, the only logical reason would be if they intended to take them both alive. "I think they're after you too." "What makes you think that?" Anko asked without looking back. "They haven't been trying to kill you, not as much as they did the Anbu that were with us. But I can't figure out why they're just aiming to cripple instead of kill." "It's probably because I used to be one of Orochimaru's students," she said after a pregnant pause. "If there's any other reason, I can't think of it." The reveal nearly caused Karin to stumble upon the moss-encrusted tree branch she landed on. "Wait, what?" "I used to be one of his students before he turned traitor and received a cursed mark like them. Only mine was sealed like yours thanks to the Hokage. That's part of the reason he made me your overseer, so I'd be able to help you get through with it. The question is why they're coming after me now of all times." "I thought you were just being mean to me because I was Even now, she didn't want to finish that statement, given she was trying to distance herself from the label and the stigma it entailed. Anko looked back and gave her an annoyed look. "I'm not being mean, I'm being strict, and that's because I'm trying to make things better for you in the long run. If you go through half of what I went through, then you'll be facing a lot of hate for what Orochimaru has done." "What you went through?" She adjusted her glasses as she took in the facts and brought them to a logical conclusion. "They thought you were the same as me. You weren't, but they didn't see it that way, did they? The people who matter to me never thought that. But the fact that the man I once trained under had turned into the greatest traitor in the Leaf's history and marked me are still inescapable facts." She deflected another kunai with her own as she continued. "The first few years after his defection were especially hard, but even though things got better, I still get the occasional looks. I'm going to have to live with it for the rest of my life." "And so will I," Karin realized. "That's what you're trying to tell me." She nodded. "Remember, I told you before all it takes is getting just one wrong person in power to think you're not as loyal as you should be, and your life becomes even harder than it already is. I speak from personal experience, and that's why I'm strict. I'm trying to train you to follow orders to the letter, since anything less than perfect will cast suspicion on you." "You could have explained it like that the first time," Karin said. "I thought you had it out for me since the day we met." Leaving aside that I don't like talking about anything dealing with my past, unless it's relevant, I shouldn't have to. It would have defeated the purpose of teaching you. Besides, not everyone is going to be straightforward with you, even if they only want what's best for you. Karin said nothing to that, instead focusing on the sniper, who was no longer suppressing his chakra. Instead, he was pumping it through all the threads. Only by trailing the flow with her mind's eye did she notice the funneling walls of webbing, woven of silk and reinforced by chakra to cut off all the other paths of escape. The sniper has cut off the paths to the side, and the other two chasing us are suddenly moving faster. They're boxing us in now. That's not all. She picked up what looked to be a large bundle that seemed to drink in the offered chakra, stirring life inside of it above their heads. Something was coming out. Something's falling above us. Anko looked up as Karin did, where they registered hundreds of spiders the size of their fists descending. Using hand seals to mold her chakra into the appropriate technique, the older Kunoichi breathed out a stream of fire that spread above them like an umbrella as it pushed upwards. Swallowed by the scorching blaze, cinders left behind rained down as they continued running. The web of chakra that permeated the canopy kept lengthening and hatching more cocoons housing newborn spiders, even when they tried to avoid them. Spinning lines of silk reinforced with their chakra to tighten the net that they were in. By the time Anko and Karin arrived at what would be the exit of the forest, it had been completely covered in a wall of webbing. They were trapped. "Damn," Anko said as the spiders closed in further, dotting the webbing that covered their surroundings and the canopy. The two who had been chasing them so far blocked the way they came in, and standing on the web just beneath the canopy was the six-armed sniper. She passed a pair of kunai to Karin. "I'll distract them. Make a break for it if you find an opening." Karin took them, but didn't find the thought of ditching her overseer to save herself as appealing as she would have maybe a day or so before. Even so, fighting against these odds was impossible for them alone or together. Even if she had the chakra to restrain all of them with her chakra chains, it didn't take care of the fact that there were hundreds of spiders and a sniper waiting to fire down on them from above. Despair weighed upon when she thought that this was how she was going to be dragged back, losing a second chance at a new life. But then hope sparked upon sensing a familiar pair of chakra signatures entering her range at an inhumanly swift pace. She didn't know how Naruto found her, but she knew it was him. "The webs are reinforced with chakra," Karin yelled at the top of her lungs as he neared, unwilling to let him run into it blindly. "Use wind chakra to break through it." There was a spike of wind chakra in response, swirling around the speeding signatures. Then Byako violently tore through the wall of webbing and came to an abrupt stop, displacing the wind chakra in the form of a squall. The rushing wall of air smashed the spiders threatening to descend upon them and battered the three that sought to capture them with enough force that it blew them off their feet and deeper into the forest. "Get on," Naruto ordered from atop Byako. Both of the Kunoichi did so, not bothering with questions. Then, as abruptly as they appeared, Byako shot out of the way it came and towards freedom. "You came for me," Karin said as she embraced Naruto from behind and laid her head on his back, grateful for the fact that he showed up right when they needed him the most. "You really came for me." "I did promise I wouldn't abandon you," he said in a weary tone. "I figured when I got attacked you did too, so I had Byako track you down." Karin's head snapped up in alarm at that. She took notice that his chakra levels weren't all that high after that little stunt. Not to mention he looked as exhausted as they were. "Did Kabuto come after you too?" He nodded. "He sent Mizuki, who explained he broke him out with the rest of the prisoners. I managed to beat him and send a message to the old man, but it took a lot of chakra to get from the land of honey to here in such a short time. Byako won't be able to last much longer either." "Pull over," Karin said. "There should be enough time for me to replenish Byako's chakra reserves enough to get a little closer to the village before they catch up." Naruto nodded and Byako slowed to a crawl before lowering itself so that the three could climb down. Then Byako returned to its sealed form and Karin began convert her remaining chakra into yang chakra in order to fill the mask. Before she could, Anko abruptly flung a kunai close to her feet and Karin nearly dropped the mask in surprise. That was when she noticed that a white snake had been impaled upon it. The kunai had burrowed into the brain, killing it for certain before it could sink its fangs into her. However, an abnormal amount of blood bubbled from the wound, spilling out and spreading over the ground like ink. Karin backed away as she felt Kabuto's chakra stemming from it, turning the spilled blood into sealing script before releasing a burst of white smoke that heralded a summoning. The smoke cleared with the passing of a night breeze that rolled through the grass around them. There was now a pale-skinned young man where the serpent had been, whose white hair swayed as he stood there and took in his surroundings. His emerald eyes lingered on the three for a moment before he spoke. So they failed like he expected. I suppose I'll have to bring all three of you and myself to repay the debt I owe to Lord Orochimaru. Those same eyes locked onto Karin's and fear shot up her spine. Her instincts were screaming that he was dangerous and that they had to escape while they could. But before she could move or react, he was in front of her with his palm on her abdomen. "Starting with you," he said. Then there was a hot flash of pain in her stomach that rippled through her body and robbed her of the ability to breathe. A sound that her brain registered as being similar to a twig being broken in half followed as he pulled his hand away. Karin's eyes remained fixed on her stomach, where something white was now sticking out of it. Strength fled from her body. She fell to her knees and Byaku's mask slipped through her fingers before the pain of being impaled registered and she fell down screaming. In his tired, exhaustive state, the last thing Naruto should have noticed was the way that the air became tinged with the scent of Karin's blood. Perhaps it was a sign he was closer to utilizing the fox's chakra than he should have been. Perhaps it was a sign he was already drawing upon it to an extent. It would make sense, all things given. He had spent all night riding on Byaku, giving everything he had to rescue Karin in the nick of time, and he thought that he'd succeeded too, recalling her softness and warmth against his back mere minutes ago. Yet, in a single moment, this newcomer snatched it away with a thrust of his hand and tainted the memory with the poignant scent of her blood now on the wind. It dyed his world red, stretched and slowed his time, set his fevered blood boiling with rage. The rancorous chakra that belonged to the nine-tailed fox bubbled over like a frothing geyser, churning and heating the wind around him as the white-haired assailant extended his fingers towards him and shot something out. A long membrane of corrupted chakra burst out to meet the white blurs in the form of a tail, constrained to his body by the shroud that outlined his figure. The bone projectiles that had been launched were dissolved within the stretching crimson, wasted away by the virulent potency of the baneful chakra. The point of the tail continued on undeterred, spearing through the air with the intention of punching straight through the pale torso of the sound shinobi. White hair swayed as Kimimaro pivoted on his foot. The twisting motion allowed the spearing tail to pass him by harmlessly as white blades emerged from his forearm. Using the momentum of the spin, he launched them towards the Jinchuriki while jumping out of the way as the tail curled back around to try and crush him. The ivory blades, bones flattened and sharpened like knives, didn't make it within an inch of Naruto's skin. The dense shroud had finished forming and batted them away with contemptuous ease, as if it were a living thing. With rage shading his eyes, his facial feature darkened and bestial, Naruto was mere moments away from lunging like a rabid animal. It was only then, only as his senses registered Karin's screams of anguish, that he managed to grab the reins of the sudden influx of chakra. The screams meant that she was alive in pain, but alive. It was enough for him to regain his control, after the lapse brought about by the sudden surge of blinding rage, and register the presence behind him. Anko was there, holding one hand with the flesh looking singed. He'd injured her without even being aware she was there. Now her gaze shifted between him and the bone user, assessing if she was facing more than one threat at that very moment. "Sorry," Naruto said with a feral tinge in his voice as he eyed the approaching opponent pulling a blade of bone from his shoulder. As much as he regretted it, he didn't have time to do anything else. The guilt would simply have to serve as the tether that kept Naruto aloft and aware of himself. "Help her. I'll deal with him." The older kunoichi nodded, seeing that he'd stopped himself from drowning in the murderous desires of the fox and regained control. Don't drop your guard against him. Kimimaro extended his palms towards Anko as she ran towards her downed charge and launched a pair of stake-shaped bones to halt her. She pulled out a trio of kunai and flung them with her good hand in response. Bone and steel met in a head-on collision that knocked them aside as she continued on. He then rushed her in a blur of motion, with his bladed bone ready to strike her legs from underneath her. Naruto's tail fired out again to intercept him like a crimson lance. Kimimaro made to dodge it with a twist of his body. At the same time, another sharpened bone emerged from his leg to cut through Anko's tendon in the process. The extended tail turned into a third hand that expanded and smashed into the sound shinobi's unprotected chest before it could touch her. Flesh smoldered where it made contact as the hand carried Kimimaro several body lengths before he could twist himself free and fall to a knee. He sucked in a sharp breath of air, holding the spot where malevolent chakra had left its mark upon him. But he brushed it aside to raise his arm and fire again at Anko. Naruto rushed forward with a roar, driving his foot towards his opponent's face in a flying kick before he could take the shot. It met a hard surface instead as Kimimaro blocked the kick with his forearm. Then there was a lancing streak of pain as needle-like bones jutted out of the arm, piercing the bottom of his combat sandal and through the top of his foot. Naruto tried pulling back his foot while taking a swipe with his hand, which were now claws shrouded in the crimson chakra meant to rip the bone user to pieces. Kimimaro danced out of the way, leaving the half-withered bones wedged into Naruto's foot, and grew more to replace them all over his body as he spun around. The dance of the larch tore into Naruto's shroud and body with a spinning motion, only for the snaking tail to force Kimimaro to break off the attack or be ran through. He brought his hand to his mouth as he landed some distance away, blocking the hoarse and bloody cough that followed. In contrast, Naruto snarled as the injuries began to boil away, torn flesh and damaged muscles destroyed, and then regenerated within the shroud. Even the bones that had lodged themselves into his body had been wasted away to nothing within it. Compared to the pale skin of his opponent that was blemished and singed where direct contact with the shroud had been made, it was evident that a battle of endurance would only serve to benefit Naruto. Perhaps coming to that realization as well, Kimimaro allowed his cursed seal of earth blossom across his frame. Black markings crawled across his skin as ivory bones pierced from the inside out and pushed aside flesh. They wove together, dark lines spiraling around the bones to the very tip of the points. Naruto's tail swished in the face of the change. Instinct ran high within his mind that what lurked in front of him was a dangerous foe to face. The urging to call upon another tale of power was only suppressed by his human reasoning as he stayed atop of the rancor and charged. Kimimaro responded by changing his stance so that the bones jutting from his arms, legs, and chest were aimed for Naruto. With a grunt and flex of his muscles, they all fired at once. In an instant, he'd filled the intervening space with sharpened bones marked with blackened tips. Like a flail, the crimson tail came around to shield Naruto against the white and black rain of death. The density of the bones had increased through the markings that lined them, rendering them capable of passing through the shroud of corrupted yang chakra. He brought his arms around and protected his body as they grazed and pierced him in various places, leaving him falling to his knees in pain as his blood seeped into the bubbling membrane covering him and darkened it further. The rustle of cloth reached his ears before he noticed the presence now behind him. He twisted around, bringing his chakra arms around to sweep away the threat. It was too high as Kimimaro lowered himself, using his arm as a pivot while sweeping his spike-covered leg around and scything away more of Naruto's flesh as it tore open his stomach. It's no good if I don't go further, Naruto realized then, and there as he tried to get away from the whirling kick that Kimimaro followed up with, expanding the blade like spines jutting out of his skin. He wouldn't be able to dodge another hit like that unless he took it another step further. So he reluctantly opened himself up to more of the malevolent chakra of the nine-tailed fox, blossoming into a second tail. The urge to murder increased with the potency of the corrupted yang chakra bleeding out of his tenketsu as the shroud thickened. The bones that made contact with it decayed into nothingness hastily, forcing Kimimaro to back away. Refusing to let him get away, the twin tails turned into elongated hands that came crashing down on the bone user with enough force that they caved in the ground beneath his very feet. Kimimaro stopped himself from being crushed to death by expanding the bones and shaping them into a shell. The strain on his face was evident, even as the markings from his cursed seal etched themselves across the ivory shell in a desperate attempt to avoid having it crumble away. But the bloody cough that tore itself from his throat, leaving trails of crimson to stream down the corner of his lips, made it clear that he wouldn't last long. Naruto roared as he brought his chakra arms around to join the second set of hands and encompass the sound shinobi. The contact with the ground was enough to putrefy it into liquid rot. He applied more force and pressure to bury the bone user beneath the slurry and felt the shell begin to crumble within his expanding grasp. Then the crumbling shell erupted as ivory spears burst out of the comparatively tiny container, like a seed abruptly sprouting. The rigid protrusions tore his chakra arms apart before smashing out of the ground and giving chase as he darted around to avoid being killed. The number continuously swelled as seconds passed, radiating outwards as the spears ascended towards the moon with a thunderous cacophony. By the time the dust cleared, Naruto could only see chalk-white formations as far as his vision stretched. The entire battlefield was overrun by bones that dwarfed the surrounding landscape. It was a forest of osseous spires that loomed ominously under the moon, towering monuments to the power of his enemy that obscured his sight in all directions. There was no telling how far it had expanded from the ground, leaving Naruto fearing that the two kunoichi had been caught up in it. So he took a running start up the nearest trunk, intending to get clear of the canopy to see if he could find them. But no sooner than he was halfway up, it did his instinct scream for him to move, and he kicked off as hastily as he could. "Og!" he screamed as a hot flash of pain flared in his abdomen. A portion of the side had been gouged out, though it was better than being skewered like a piece of meat if he hadn't moved in time. Naruto landed, cradling the wound, and glared up at his opponent. Kimimaro was seamlessly merged with the giant bone and had gone into a second-stage transformation. It had darkened his skin an almost charcoal shade, painted his eyes black, and dyed his pupils yellow. Large, thick, curved bones had sprouted from his back, leading down to a tail from which jagged spines ran along the top. Drowning out the frothing pain of the wound's regeneration with a feral snarl, he swiped an elongated chakra arm towards the bone user that had undergone a monstrous transformation that made even Gaara's look tame. The claws tore a furrow out of the trunk and nothing else. His opponent was gone, having disappeared as quickly as he appeared. Naruto's lips peeled back further in frustration as he withdrew the claw, assessed the damage, and realized just how badly the situation had gotten. The bones that had been brittle to a single tail were now dense enough that two couldn't decay and rot them quickly enough for him to do anything meaningful. Surrounded on all sides by the bony trees, he was caged in his opponent's trap similar to how Haku had done with those mirrors he possessed. All it would take is another tail to break free of this cage. His mind froze as that ruinous whisper bubbled up from that which was sealed within him. It was the nine-tailed fox with an offering of power. More than enough power to break free of the pitiful cage of bones that he was locked in and tear the one who sealed him apart limb from limb at the same time. Naruto entertained the thought for a brief moment. It even brought a smile to his face. Then he shook his head, trying to push it down. That wasn't him. That wasn't what he wanted. He wanted to protect Karin and get her to safety, not go on a murderous rampage. The two weren't the same. His own desires were separate from that of the malevolent instincts of the nine-tailed fox's chakra. The moment he forgot that and fell to the temptation to do so was the moment he lost himself entirely. The distraction passed as more bones emerged from the ground. It was like a giant bear trap, jagged points acting as teeth that tried to clamp shut around his body. He dodged them with ease, only to be lashed from behind courtesy of Kimimaro's tail and sent flying backwards until he crashed into the base of another tree-sized bone spire. The impact was hard enough to create a crater, making his vision flash. His awareness returned in less than a second, but that was long enough for a lashing whip forged of bone and cartilage to coil around the trunk he was backed against. All at once it tightened around his body, binding him in place as the spines on the vertebrae pierced his flesh and those that touched the bone structure melded into it to form a band. Kimimaro went into another coughing fit as he left Naruto pinned in place. This time it was far more violent. Blood splattered against the ground as he fell onto his arms and knees, every heaving breath pulling from his lungs. His failing health didn't deter him for long as he pulled himself towards the nearest overgrown bone and melded into it. Not 5 seconds later, Naruto's sharpened senses heard distant crashing and a shout of surprise coming from further in the ossified forest. Karin felt uneasy as she and Anko rode atop Byakko among the towering ivory spires. They had been spared from harm as it went up, but were trapped within the resulting forest. Worse was the fact that she wasn't able to sense the one who'd done it at all with her mind's "I sense it happened," as if he'd become one with his surroundings. In contrast, Naruto's signature shone like a beacon, even though it was drowned in that of the nine-tailed fox's chakra. The fact that he wasn't moving only compounded her worry, so she urged Byakko to rush towards him so they could collect him and go home together. An ominous rumbling filled the air as they grew closer. It was the sound of crumbling bones. The thick osseous trees surrounding them began to collapse in on themselves, forcing Byakko to deftly dodge the falling debris as they smashed into one another. That was when the ambush was sprung. The bone user appeared out of nowhere and tackled Byakko with all the strength that his monstrous transformation could muster, and a scream tore itself out of Karin's mouth as the impact threw her free of Byakko. Her slender body was sent skipping across the ground before she slid to a stop. She sucked in a sharp and pained breath as she forced her head up to see that she had gotten lucky. The older Kunoichi had been curled within the transformed shinobi's tail, straining to get free as it tightened around her arms and chest. Byakko had been gored through by the thick pair of bones that were on his back, rendering it unable to hold itself together. The white tiger dissipated, leaving only the mask behind to fall slowly towards the ground. Karin saw him eye it clearly and knew what was going to happen next. She tried to get to her feet in a desperate attempt to stop a piece of her clan's legacy from being lost. But it was all for nothing as a single stomp of his foot shattered the mask that served as Byakko's vessel. "You will answer for your betrayal of Lord Orochimaru," he said, grinding his foot into the fragments of the mask. Karin collapsed onto her knees and sat there as he approached, eyes fixed on the remnants of the mask and hands extended as though reaching for it. Even as he crafted a blade of bone to slice through her arms and legs, she didn't move or stop reaching for Byakko. There was no point. "Ruin!" Anko forced out, even as she struggled for breath. Karin remained there despite the urging, still reaching out towards Byakko's mask that had been destroyed. "Go!" Karin ignored the order, instead focused on all of the unspent yang chakra that was released now that the seals storing it in the mask had been destroyed. As the blade descended, she reached out to it with every ounce of desire, desperation, and instinct in her body. And the chakra responded by wrapping the sound shinobi in chakra chains for an instant, anchored through her outstretched palms. "What?" The surprise was evident in his voice as the chakra chains cocooned him for a mere moment, hampering his transformation. That was as long as she could maintain the desperate attempt at shaping the chakra outside of her body. "Get clear!" Karin yelled as her concentration faltered. "Now!" Anko listened. She broke free from his grasp as the transformation regressed until the chains shattered like glasswork and snatched Karin away before he could bring his blade down on her. It wasn't a moment too soon as the second reason that Karin didn't run came rushing in, slamming into the sound shinobi with a thunderous impact that kicked up a plume of dust as it sent him careening into the collapsed heap of bone rubble. Sporting 3 tails that swayed ominously, what was left of Naruto roared loud enough that it echoed throughout the battlefield.
Well, that will be all for part 7. Thank you for watching, and check out the author of this fanfic in the description. Like the video so other people can see this video.